well into NHL and NBA playoffs, which means that you're going to hear a lot of cliches on TV and on the radio. Things like, we got to take it one game at a time. We just got to give it 110%. We got to get the puck on the net more, and we need more traffic in front of the net. We got to win the battles in the corners and play a full 60 minutes. It's clutch time or crunch time, depending on who's talking. We got to get on the same page, and it's going to require a whole team effort unless there is one person who can carry the whole team on their shoulders, which is also another option. And we've got to play for the name on the front of the jersey rather than the name on the back, which is maybe one of my favorites. And we've seen kind of the results of that this season. If you've been following the NHL at all, one of the expansion team, the Las Vegas Golden Knights, has defied expectations. In the early service, I said they defied the odds, which was ironic because they're from Las Vegas. It was accidental, but it worked, so it was there. But they've completely defied the odds. Neil Payne, one of the commentators, he said that this team was constructed as a Frankenstein's monster of unwanted parts from the rest of the league, which is maybe a good metaphor for the church. And they've continued to just defy expectations right into the playoffs and continue to contend. Because they recognize, again, that it's not about them as individuals, it's about them as a team, and there's been something that's happened to them as they gelled together, and each member of the team has contributed to the success of that team, played their role. It's not just in sports that this happens, right? Some of you have been involved in music, in quartets or bands or orchestras, and you've had that same feeling. All of a sudden, all the hard practice plays off, and as everybody just gets their part, there's this fun. I don't even know what word to describe it. It's not easy because there's work that's involved, but everybody, there's this sense of momentum that starts to carry you. In drama, it happens. In work environments, a crisis hits or a big job comes in unexpectedly, and everybody drops what they're doing, and they play their role, and there's a sense of celebration and camaraderie and teamwork that's fun and exciting. This is how Paul says the church is supposed to function. Not just the institution of the church, not just the organization of the church, but the individuals who are part of the community of faith who are following Jesus. We're to function in this way. We're right in the second week of our series that we're calling Renewed, looking at the last few chapters of this letter that Paul wrote to Christians who follow Jesus, living in the Roman Empire, in the city of Rome, somewhere around the middle of the first century after Jesus' death and resurrection, his ascension to heaven. And in these chapters, we're looking at what does a renewed mind look like? What does it look like in different areas of our lives and different aspects of society? And this week, we're looking at the question, what does a renewed mind look like in our relationships with one another in God's family? And Paul uses a metaphor to describe these relationships that if you've grown up in the church, if you've been around for a while in the church, is probably so familiar to you that you are tempted to tune out. You've heard it before. We're a body. I got it. Time to crush some candy. You pull out your phone, right? I get that. But sometimes we need a reminder of things that are familiar to us, to fully understand them, to understand them at a new level. And further, as we learned last week, it's not just about knowledge. It's not just about knowing that we're a body. It's about the practice of being the body. So rather than trying to convince you today that we are a body, I want to talk about the practice or the implications of being that body. And I think the key implication comes in verse 5, where Paul writes, "So in Christ, we, though many, form one body." There's the metaphor. And here's the implication. "And each member belongs to all the others." Right, when we understand the metaphor that Paul's making, that we are like a body, we understand what Paul is saying here, that no one part, no one member represents the whole. Right, if I were to introduce you, but you only got to meet my big toe, you wouldn't really understand fully who I am. You would need to meet all of me in order to understand who I am. In the same way, if we're going to represent Christ in this world, no one member represents the wholeness of Christ or his body. So we need each other. We belong to each other. And more than that, we're not just independent parts that happen to gather together in one room for 1 hour on a Sunday to worship. We're integrated with one another. We're dependent on one another. There's a overlapping, a mutuality between us. Every member, each member, belongs to all the others. And this means that you, as a member of the body, have a responsibility and a role to play in the body, in this local community. Paul continues to unpack this for us in verse 6. He says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. You notice there's no exceptions. If you have received God's grace, you have received his gift. And again, I think we agree with this, at least as information, but let's explore the implication of this. This means that it's not just the leaders, the pastors, the Sunday school teachers, the small group leaders, the worship leaders. It's not just them who have been given a gift. Each of us has been given a gift by the grace of God. Each member of the faith community has a function and a role to play. Stuart Briscoe, in his commentary, kind of comments on how we see ourselves in the church today. And he says, because we live in a specialized world, it'll come up on the screen here, because we live in a specialized world, we have tended to form churches around the specialist and have encouraged the congregation to participate more as spectators and critics than participants in the ministry. Right? We've formed it, we come to believe, at least in practice, that it's only the specialists who have the gifts, and the rest of us get to comment on those gifts, affirm them, or critique them. You even hear that we have to fight against this tendency, but you even hear it when we kind of slip up and we sometimes call our connection cards comment cards, right? That's this coming out. And we need to fight that tendency. Remember last week we talked about that we're all priests. We all have a priestly function. We all have a responsibility to acknowledge Jesus' presence in our world, to point it out, and to reflect his presence and his glory to the people around us. And what Paul's saying in this passage is that Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, has given each one of you a gift or gifts in order to fulfill that role. That as you practice your gift, as you use your gift in the community of faith, you help to reveal God's presence among us and reflect his glory to the people around us. And so this means that Jesus has placed you in the context of this local community of faith within our family because he has given you something that this family needs. He's given you something that to contribute to the mission of his body, of this local body here in Lethbridge. We see how this kind of thinking requires a renewed mind, right? Because if we're conforming to the patterns of the world, then we see participating in the community of faith as about my own happiness, however you happen to define that. If we conform to the patterns of this world, we see ourselves as the customer. We shop for a church that will meet our needs and desires. And if the church at some point fails to meet those needs and desires, we just take our business elsewhere. And Paul says, no, you're not. The church isn't a business. It's not a business, it's a family, it's a body. We belong to each other. And this requires that we have a renewed mind. When we have a renewed mind, we realize that participating in the community of faith is not about my pursuit of my definition of my happiness. Rather, it's about how we can collectively pursue and reflect God's glory to the world. When we have a renewed mind, we recognize that each member belongs to all the others. When we have a renewed mind, we recognize that participating in the community of faith is not about what we can get from the community of faith, but what we have been gifted to give to the community of faith, to contribute to the community of faith. We see ourselves not as a customer, but as a contributor to the mission of reflecting Jesus' glory. When we have a renewed mind, we recognize that we have been given gifts not to collect those gifts, but to use those gifts. And Paul places some parameters around the use of these gifts and our attitudes around them. He starts in verse 3 by saying, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. And I think there are two primary ways that we do this. One is that we think that we are God's gift to the church, rather than recognizing that we have been given God's gift for the church. See, because we have conformed to the worldly pattern of economic materialism, we create hierarchies of importance. Remember, economic materialism says that my value or my worth is determined by what I produce or what I contribute. And in order to convince myself and the rest of you that I have value in this community and that I should be included in this community, I have to convince you that God's gift given to me contributes more, produces more in the community. Notice what Paul says in verse 6. Remember this, he says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. According to the grace given to each of us. Paul's saying here that God's gift to you is a result of God's grace to you. You didn't earn it. You don't deserve it. It's not given to you by merit. It is grace. It's a gift that he gives freely to you. Secondly, we think more highly of ourselves than we ought when we assume that we get to decide how and when we'll use our gifts, right? When we conform to the pattern of individualism, we begin to think it's my gift and I've decided God wants me to use it in this way, and your responsibility as the community of faith is to provide me with the opportunity and resources to use my determination of my giftedness to pursue what I think is my dream. Can you imagine what that would look like if our physical bodies acted in this way? That actually happened to me the other day. A couple of weeks ago, we had Stephen Ney here speaking to us, and he came and spoke to our staff on the Tuesday following the Sunday. One of the things that he said to our staff was that you should do something that you're not really good at. And I knew immediately what that was for me. I had joined the marathon club at Runner's Soul here, and I am not good at running. In fact, somebody told me that they saw me yesterday running, and I was embarrassed because I knew where I was. Like, I said I was at the back of the pack. They corrected me. I was second from the back, okay? I am slow. But a week ago, we were doing our long run because our half marathon is coming up. So we did a 12-mile run. And about 10 miles into that run, we were running down Mayor McGrath North, and there's a Tim Hortons over on my right-hand side, and my calf muscle in my right leg decides that it has been called to not run, it has been called to go to Tim Hortons. And so it tries to convince the rest of the body that we are done running and we are going to Tim Hortons because donuts and coffee are way better than what you are making me do. And at this point in the run, the rest of the body is ready to be convinced that it should stop and just go to Tim's. But my will has to determine, no, we have a purpose. We have to finish this run. And so something, I don't know if it was my mind or my heart, whatever it wasn't my heart was beating too fast. It's like coffee, donuts. Had to convince my calf muscle that what it was hearing as it's calling was not right. We had a purpose to fulfill. So I had to give it some attention. I had to walk for a little while. I had to stretch it out, and eventually it came into line, right? It came into line. You have gifts, that's clear. Paul's really clear about that. You may also have a dream about how you want to use your gifts. But as part of the body, you can't just go off in your own direction. We belong to each other, Paul says. We have to live in mutual submission to one another. This even works with the gift of leadership, which he lists in verses 6 to 8. See, having the gift of leadership, it doesn't mean that you get to decide what everybody else does. That's not what the gift of leadership is. In mutual submission with one another, if we have the gift of leadership, we submit our plans and our directions and our dreams to one another in the body. And then as we mutually submit to that, as we mutually agree to those plans and directions and dreams, then we mutually contribute our gifts to one another to get us to where we are going. It's mutual submission. And I recognize that we tend to swing from one extreme to the other, right? We tend to swing from the extreme that I am God's gifts, God has given me the gift, I get to decide how I use it, to I don't have any gifts. I have nothing to offer. And Paul actually offers a corrective to that in this verse as well. He says, rather, think of yourself with sober judgment. Think of yourself with sober judgment. Paul says there's no room for false humility. There's no room for pretending that you don't have a gift. You have a gift. So think soberly about it. And when you pretend that you don't, you actually devalue the gift that God has given to you. You devalue His grace in your life. Because God has gifted you with something that is essential to contribute to the mission of this church. He wants you to participate fully with it. It's a gift, so don't get arrogant. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. But it's essential. So be confident in the use of that gift. It's not just false humility that prevents us from using our gifts. Sometimes I think we get so distracted by trying to figure out what our gifts are and what their corresponding function and definition is that we fail to serve. You notice in this list of gifts that Paul doesn't focus on the definitions of the gifts or the function of the gifts. What Paul's most concerned about is that you are using your gift. Look at his language in verse 6. Of Romans chapter 12, verse 6. He says, if your gift is prophesying, then prophesy. Don't try to figure out what prophesying, just prophesy. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is giving encouragement, I think is next. Let's go to the next slide. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Right? There's no room for false modesty. If this is your gift, just use it, Paul says. Use it fully. Lean into it. Let's think of another way to think about this. God's gift is God's grace to you. And it's given to you to help us as the community of faith to manifest, to reflect His glory, to reflect His love and His grace to the world around us. So rather than just getting caught up on what is my gift, maybe we need to change the question to how can I best reflect God's glory, reflect God's love, reflect God's grace in this situation? How can I best do that? I have a friend, her name is Robin. She's a friend of our family's, and if you don't know her, you really want to get to know her. She's a wonderful woman. And Robin has the gift of giving gifts. She's an excellent gift giver. Because she'll look at a situation, she'll look at what's going on in your life, and she has this ability just to find the perfect gift for that moment. Sometimes it's humorous, sometimes it's super meaningful and moving, but this is her ability. And if you were to look at the list of gifts in Romans 12 or in 1 Corinthians or in Ephesians or anywhere else that we have lists of gifts, you would not find the gift of giving gifts listed there. And I don't know exactly how Robin's thought processes go. Maybe she's so used to it. Maybe she's just been gifted by the Spirit. It almost comes naturally to her. But I sort of imagine that she looks at the situation and she goes, how can I best demonstrate love and grace to this person? And she finds the perfect gift to give them. This is the question, right? How can I best demonstrate God's grace and love in this situation? And when we do that, maybe it's just me, but I sort of see it in this passage, and as I imagine what it would look like as we live this passage out, I feel this undercurrent of joy, not obligation, but because you're doing what you were created to do. Right? Lean into your gift, Paul says. If your gift is prophesying, just prophesy. Enjoy that. Lean into it fully. Do what you were created to do. Do what you were gifted to do. It reminds me of Eric Liddell, whose story was turned into Chariots of Fire, the movie. He lived in the early 1900s. He was an Olympic athlete from Scotland in 1924. And he was a runner. And he discovered about a few months before the Olympics were to be held that the 100-meter race was going to be, which was his specialty, what he was expected to win, was going to be held on a Sunday. And because of his faith in God, he felt like he couldn't do that and glorify God. He couldn't run on a Sunday. And so he switched to the 400-meter race, and he was not expected to win that, but he, by God's grace and because of his amazing athletic ability, ended up winning the gold medal. And after the Olympics, he went on to serve the church as a missionary, wrote some books. This is something that he said that has stuck with me. He says this, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." When I run, I feel his pleasure because he's doing what he was made to do. And when you add that kind of individual pleasure and add it to the opportunity to do it as part of a well-coordinated, mutually submitted community of faith, my brothers and sisters, that's joy. That is joy. Each member belongs to all the others. And this creates a wonderful, maybe even inspiring picture, but it has to move beyond an inspiring picture. God's intention isn't just that it would be some idea to be aspired to, but that it would be a reality that we live. And I think that's what Paul means when he says in verse 9, he says, love must be sincere. Love must be real. This has to be really true. It has to be lived out in reality. And that's where the challenge comes, doesn't it? Each member belongs to all the others. This is what we celebrate. This is what we communicate when we gather around the table and take the bread and drink the cup. We remember, we celebrate that all of us who have received God's grace are part of this community of faith, that all of us who have received God's grace have a place at this table, that all of us who have received God's grace have God's gifts to contribute to the mission of this church, to reflect his glory. But gathering around the table is relatively easy, especially in a group this size, because our lives don't necessarily have to rub up against each other. So let's get right down to the nitty-gritty. Let's get right down to the real life. For a long time, we've been having conversations about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, and we're pretty convinced that to grow in our discipleship and to help others grow in their discipleship, that we need to be in close relationship with one another. And we've become pretty convinced that happens in our community groups, but even beyond that, in smaller groups within our community groups, something that we call me and threes, when we get into groups of 3 or 4 and we share life with one another. And there's been some pushback on this and some objection or resistance to this idea, partly because we're really busy and our schedules are full, and I get that. But I've also heard a lot of conversation about there are just some people that I can't imagine including in that close community. And I get that. Right? There's people that are easier for us to get along with and people that we have more in common with. But I'm not convinced that just being in that kind of relationship with people who are easier to get along with or that we have more in common with is what Paul has in mind here in Romans. I'm not sure it's what Jesus had in mind when he called us to be the community of faith. Because here's what's at stake if we don't get this right. Towards the end of his life, Jesus gathered his disciples in the garden and he prayed. And one of the things that he prayed was for all of us who would hear the message of the gospel and would come to faith in Jesus, that we would be one as he is one with the Father. As the Father and the Son are in each other, that we would be in each other's lives so that the world would know that he was sent by God. And so, as long as each and all does not really mean each and all in the nitty-gritty details of our lives, the world has reason to question the identity and the ministry and the message of Jesus. Even more than that, Paul writes another letter to a group of followers of Jesus who are living in the city of Ephesus. And he says to them that God's intent was to show his manifold wisdom, his deep, multi-layered, multifaceted wisdom to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms through the unity of the church. And what he had in mind there was not just that, when the church gets together for 1 hour in one place on a Sunday, But as their lives interlap with one another, as we get involved in the reality of life with one another, we would display the manifold wisdom of God to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. So if we don't get this right, as long as each and all does not really mean each and all, then the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms have reason to doubt the wisdom of God. Each member belongs to all the others. So if each and all doesn't include those members that we see as difficult or awkward or challenging or not a good fit, then this just remains a lofty idea and not a lived reality. Love must be sincere. It must be real. It has to be demonstrated in the nitty-gritty details of real life. This is what a renewed mind looks like in the community of faith. I said there's an undercurrent of joy throughout this passage. This would be the undercurrent of commitment. It requires a commitment on our part. But there's also this undercurrent of the gospel all throughout this letter. This whole section begins with, in view of God's mercy. In view of God's mercy. So my message is not, if each and all does not really mean each and all in your life, then try harder to include each and all. That's not my message. The message is this. If you look at your life and you recognize that each and all does not really mean each and all in the real details of your life, then reflect on God's mercy and how it extends to each and all, including you. And as you begin to understand who you are in view of God's mercy, your mind will be transformed and your outlook will be transformed to see others in God's family in view of God's mercy as well.